So welcome to our next Informed Investing session. Africa 2025, Splits, Splinters, and New Horizons. Pratibha Thakkar is our speaker. She leads the Economist Intelligence Unit's regional teams, which includes a Middle East and Africa team. She has many years' experience in ensuring that the EIU's forecasts and analysis for countries' economies are closely integrated with its global macroeconomic outlook. She holds an MSc and a BSc in economics from the University of London. She also holds an MA in area studies from SOAS here in London as well. So over to you.
Thank you. I can see that I've come in the middle of your lunch break. How did you negotiate this, Jamie? Anyway, it's a pleasure to be here, everyone. And today, I will walk you through what to anticipate in terms of investment and economic prospects in Africa for the coming year and the future, the medium term. Africa is not about 1 year opportunity. It is very much long term. So if you don't think about your strategy in that way, you will get it wrong. Okay, so a very interesting, busy global map. And I feel that this is very much needed in today's world. What is dominating is the geopolitics, influencing the global economy in a number of ways. And we saw it kick off during the pandemic, and it's very much accelerated post-pandemic as well. And it's very much influenced, as you'll see in Europe, by the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war. We just passed the anniversary, the first anniversary of the Middle East conflict yesterday. The Sudan war that started 2 years ago, the civil war, is ongoing, looking at very little sign of coming to an end. US-China tensions. Regardless of who comes into the White House in January 2025, you're going to see that taking a different level, part of geopolitics, and very quickly having a major impact in supply chain, value chain. Nobody should be talking about decoupling. It will be about building resilience chains. Resilience is going to be the buzzword going forward, at least for the next couple of decades. On the back of that, you are going to be seeing China, which slowed down in China, the growth, which has been kicking off since the pandemic, getting slowly even further down, and that is also on the back of US-China relationship. What does China's slowdown mean as well for Africa? Major trading partner, investor over the last 25 years. And you will see that relationship unraveling in different ways. With that in mind, geopolitics very much spilling into geoeconomics, combined together. Those are the big things. One of the big issues also is the pandemic lockdown damage that took place across the world. That is permanent damage. Less of an impact in Africa, but certainly across the world, particularly in the Western world. The advanced economies, they've taken on huge debt. Public debt has increased tremendously. On the back of that, what we've seen is a wind of protectionism taking place. This was the year of the big elections, and you saw a lot of right-wing governments coming into office. What is that about? Okay, with that in mind, what is the Africa story? I would say, this is my opinion, the next 2 decades belongs to Africa. This is the final frontier when you look around the world. And it's going to be the fastest growing region in 2025 and going forward as well, very much ahead of emerging Asia. Going back to what I said about China, the slowdown in China, it's a major deficit they're leaving behind. India is growing, but not sufficient to fill that deficit. And of course, the Middle East. The GCC states have been growing tremendously on the back of higher oil prices, but also diversification across Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, and all those countries. Within the region, with the exception of Sudan, you are going to see positive growth. And you can see that with the numbers there as well. Some growing stronger. Niger, for instance, is going to have in the region of 20% next year. And you could say, why? Given the political situation there, one of the biggest uranium mine is coming on stream. And this is the Africa story. East and West Africa will do remarkably well as sub-regions. They'll be speeding ahead. North Africa, definitely dragged down by Egypt. Egypt is still a major market, regardless of which way ever you look at it. The major heavyweights, the regional heavyweights, Nigeria, Angola, South Africa are the biggest drag, and there have been for the last few years as well. Going forward, you are going to see some positive growth there on the back of some of the domestic and global headwinds. Nevertheless, they're not going to be back on the level they were before even the pandemic. So mostly to do with domestic elements there, dragging down overall regional growth. Resource-rich countries will naturally do well, continue to do well, particularly countries with the mining, oil, hydrocarbons. This is all very much what investors are looking for in this continent. That takes me into commodity prices. What is our expectations? Very much coming back to geopolitics. We've seen the oil prices has been the most volatile this year. And what has kept the floor on oil prices for the last 2 years and basically into this year is the strict cutbacks that OPEC Plus has exercised, namely Saudi Arabia. They cut almost 1 million barrels a day overnight to keep a floor on oil prices. Our expectations going forward, the upside risk is still from the Middle East war. What we've seen in recent days, last week particularly, the acceleration of the conflict, not just with Hamas. Hamas is finished. They moved on to Hezbollah. So you can see that Israel is making major inroads in that area as well. However, our view is that still the 60% probability of being contained between Israel, Hamas, and Hezbollah, and occasionally the Houthis, and Iraq and Syria, not spreading regionally, provided the Strait of Hormuz is not disrupted. The oil prices, the fundamental of supply and demand will really dictate where oil prices go. Nevertheless, that is the one area that keeps us a bit nervous about where it's heading as well. On the other side, base metals. Coming back to the Africa minerals story, base metal prices are going to hold up going into the next few years, largely because of the global demand, where the future economies are going. We're going into green transitions in a more accelerated way, the impact of climate change as well. So this is going to be the biggest beneficial on the prices front for a number of African markets with resources going forward. Agriculture. El Nino, which kicked in at the middle of last year, which happens every 4 years. We've seen prices of agriculture shoot up this year. Coming to an end for the second half of this year, we're seeing prices coming down to more normal levels as El Nino has worked its way through the system. There is one risk as well, El Nino. There's always something. So El Nino, there's a risk of that kicking off in the final year, towards the end of this year and into next year. Certainly it's something I would just like to flag. Okay, what does this mean? The whole picture, and like going back to what I said about long and medium term. Here you can see African cities 2035. This is based on the ERU's methodology of long-term forecasts for all the countries that we cover in Africa, north, south, east, west, all the 50-plus countries. Based on the long-term forecast, looking at the development of individual countries, we have come to a place where the largest cities, based on demographics, the continent has got the fastest growing, youngest population in the world. And the demographics is going to be driving part of this Africa story, the city story. And you can see that the way, based on our methodology, The top one should not be a great surprise to you. The Greater Cairo will be right up there, followed very closely by Greater Johannesburg. This is the high-end country. The middleweight cities will be cities like Nairobi, Dar es Salaam, Kinshasa. All of this will be middleweight. The largest will be very much 100+ million population, but also driven by development. What should also be a surprise is the clusters, the business clusters we've developed, where they will be along the coastline. And the way we've identified is you're going to have Greater Horn clusters, Southern clusters, North African clusters, West African clusters. This will be the interlinked joining that takes place in the coming years as well. And we'll come to that in a little while as well. FDI, a very important story here. On the back of everything we've talked about, greenfield transition, untapped large mineral deposit in Africa. And 30% of the global untapped minerals are still in Africa. And we're talking about every mineral that's needed for tomorrow's world, electric cars, space economies, everything that we've been talking about, AI. These are the greenfield FDIs taking place. And we've seen a sharp increase in inflows of FDI, particularly for the mining. It's not just an oil story. It's not just a natural gas story. It's beyond that. It is this that is crowding the market now. And no longer is it a case. We've seen a shift from investors coming from Asia. It's not just China. It's India, Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia. You're going to see a crowded market taking place. This is where the competition is going to get quite tight. Also, GCC states, this is a recent entry, not for UAE, Dubai port, very much they control most of the ports in Africa. Nevertheless, this recent entry from the GCC states is to secure minerals and food security. This is very, very important. Untapped land for future food chain going around the world, particularly for the Middle East. This is where a record investment ranging into the 50 to 60 billion are being invested by the GCC. Recently, UAE pumped another $150 billion in Egypt. It's a joint parallel policy there, but nevertheless, they're investing heavily there. But further south, they're investing heavily for the future food security. Very, very important. Renewables. This is an area you should keep on your strategy, and what does it mean for your business? This is the one continent that's going to really have an impact across the world. Solar, hydro, all of those key areas. Asia's expanding footprint, it's not a new story. And we just saw 2 weeks ago, China-Africa Forum taking place. It's like the 5th or the 6th one in a row, if not more, and very much recommitted its footprint in Africa on trade, investment, and new funding. It's not as generous as it has been in the past, but that is a reflection of what the Chinese economies have slowed down. They've got their own internal major issues as well. So Asians are the new entry. You're going to see an increasing inflow coming from India as well, Turkey, Russia in a different way, but nevertheless, they've also got investment taking place in the mining sectors. Okay. What are the opportunities? Just highlighting some of the key areas that investors are looking at very closely. It is from agriculture to energy, mining, construction. This is a very big area for investors. For instance, energy deficit in Africa requires almost 100 billion plus investment every year for the next decade to get up to the full capacity it needs to be. This is one of the biggest downturn for African economies. We've seen that recently, particularly this year in South Africa, where lack of investment, poor policy, corruption led to almost 10 hours a day of downloading. that is a major impact on businesses, but also on the regular consumers as well. So that's just to give you a small example. Also in Kenya, we've witnessed a downloading taking place because of the energy deficit. Tremendous investment is going to go into construction. It's not just building powers or solar or nuclear. It's a number of other areas as well. Roads, airports, railway. Railway link is going to be the game changer here across the continent. Consumer goods, aspirations, going back to the city slides. There's an aspirational generation rising, internet-connected generation rising, finance and insurance. And the previous panel discussed quite a good story about it, what is happening with finance. You cannot grow the economies without a solid financial sector. Transport, logistics, innovation, ICT, the biggest revolution, industrial revolution that has taken place in Africa has been telecoms in this decade, in recent years. And that is continued to grow, high adoption rates. I think Africa had 5G before we did in the UK. Have we still got it? Perhaps not. But certainly it is an area that's had, they've leapfrogged. Industries have leapfrogged on the base of that. Travel and tourism, numbers are very positive this year. They've picked up tremendously. Despite some of the political hotspot and security, you will see that this is also an area that's got a long way to go. Can't talk about Africa without also looking at the major security hotspots. If you look at that map, you will say that is covering almost all of the continent. But you really have to narrow it down and keep in mind everything I've talked about and say, despite the security hotspot, despite the Sudan civil war, the biggest one has been the Saleh coup belt, the Saleh region. How there has been a domino effect taking place, one government after another toppled in the last 2 years based on long-standing leadership. It's not finished yet. We have got military governments in power who keeps promising elections will take place. And on the back of that, equally worrying is the private security forces in place to secure their position, like the Wagner Group, Turkish forces, Ukrainian forces we're hearing about now as well. The Saleh Belt, why is it important is most of the countries are rich in minerals, which the world does need for the future development, the green transition. Sudan war, it's showing absolutely no signs of easing off or going into a better situation. We're still expecting the Sudan war to continue next year, unfortunately. Huge humanitarian crisis. I know that the world has been dominated by what has been happening in the Middle East conflict and Ukraine, and unfortunately, Sudan has not had the right attention, right at the top, including us. So this is a very worrying development, which is having a spillover effect in the Horn of Africa as well. Very quickly, this situation can get quite uncontrollable as well. And recognizing this, you are seeing more of the Gulf partners, particularly UAE, stepping in to see what can be done. So you will see some movement there. But for the moment, we're assuming for the next year at least, and maybe even into 2026, the war will continue. But wars get tired. They do tire out by themselves as well. You know, so the fatigue has set in as well, and hopefully we will see some resolution taking place. DRC, the richest country on the continent in minerals and natural resources. Inga, River Inga. Project Inga 1 has been developed. Inga 2, if it's developed to full capacity, it will light up the whole of Africa, including the industries. So DRC is sitting on a huge abundance of natural resources, including, and Inga is not rain dependent. So it's a massive project there. It's been on the cards for a long time. It needs strong investment there as well. Okay, on a final note, I would say geopolitical Global geopolitical will continue to really influence how the economies go, but also how Africa growth prospects will depend on it. Because if you look at the major partners, it's China. China's slowdown means it has a direct impact on Africa. But there are new kids on the block: India, Russia, Turkey, US, AGOA. AGOA will be renewed next year. So you can see a number of positives as well. Africa growth story is good, 3 to 4%, but it needs 8 to 10% every year for the next 20 years to be at where it wants to be. Sustainable growth, sustainable development. That is really important. And finally, politics and policy. Politics still matters. Investors are coming in. You're seeing growth. You're seeing the cities rising. You're seeing consumers. You're seeing middle class rising. But it is the politics that really is the lever that drives the policy in the end. And how quickly things can get very wobbly, even for investors who've been in the business, in the markets for a very long time. We saw that recently in Kenya. Election out of the way, not too bumpy. There was a little bit of rumbling. Nevertheless, everything got back to business. Earlier this year, string of unmanageable demonstrations took place from the ground because of prices and lack of wage increases and job opportunities. And it shook the government. Ruto's new government, 2 years into it. But you can see that it is still a very important element you need to keep your pulse on. Okay? So it's a pretty good story there, but not without challenges. Okay? Thank you very much. Okay. I can take reasonable questions. Any questions?
Thank you very much. I mean, on every second panel, I would say macroeconomic imbalances in Africa have been discussed, in particular FX, and that has been a real problem for economic development in Africa. So what's your view on these imbalances and FX going forward?
I would do it country by country. Very much the case. And it's a very challenging area, and you can see it getting also wobbly, but it's an area, I would say, it's got a long way to go in terms of development as well, and financial sector reforms.